She hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 years. Not really. Not the kind of talking that means something. Every single night, without fail, Eleanor Mercer walked out onto that rotting porch, struck a match with trembling fingers, and lit one small candle. And every single night, the people of Black Hollow looked away, because none of them knew what to say to a woman who had buried both her husband and her 6-year-old son in the same terrible winter. They thought she was already gone. They thought grief had swallowed her whole. They were almost right. Almost. Vix e. Mata chai. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this candle travels. And stay with me until the very last word, because what happens at the end of part 5 will change the way you see grief forever. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The town of Black Hollow sat at the ragged edge of nowhere, the kind of place that appeared on older maps only because some surveyor had needed to fill in the blank space between 2 mountain ranges and couldn't bring himself to leave it empty. The main road cut straight through like a scar. A general store on one side, a livery stable on the other, a saloon that smelled permanently of sawdust and spilled whiskey, a post office that doubled as the sheriff's office when the sheriff happened to feel like working, and a handful of houses scattered behind these buildings like afterthoughts. That was Black Hollow. That was the whole of it. Most people passed through. The ones who stayed did so because they'd run out of money or run out of road, and after enough seasons went by, they stopped thinking about leaving. The frontier had a way of doing that to a person, wearing down the restlessness until what was left felt close enough to contentment that you could almost call it home. Eleanor Mercer had come to Black Hollow 12 years ago as a young bride, her husband Thomas's hand warm around hers on the wagon seat, her whole life packed into 2 trunks and a leather satchel. She remembered the way the mountains had looked that first evening, purple and enormous against an orange sky, and how Thomas had pointed and said, "There it is, Ellie, that's ours." He'd said it like the whole landscape belonged to them personally, like some agreement had been drawn up between the Mercers and the mountains, and she had laughed and told him he was ridiculous. And he had kissed her right there on the wagon seat while old Mr. Calhoun, who'd driven them from the last town, had cleared his throat loudly and stared at the road ahead. She remembered that. She would always remember that. What happened 4 years ago had not been dramatic. That was the part nobody talked about, because tragedy was supposed to announce itself, supposed to arrive with thunder and warning, giving decent people time to brace. But the illness that took Thomas and their boy, Jacob, had been quiet and insidious, the kind that crept in on a cold wind in November and simply refused to leave. Thomas had gone first, after 3 weeks of fever that no amount of willow bark tea or cool compresses could touch. Jacob had followed 17 days later, and Eleanor had sat beside his small bed in the gray light of a February morning and watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest slow down and then stop, and she had not screamed or wept or collapsed. She had simply sat there for a very long time, holding his hand, which was already cooling, listening to the wind push against the window glass. The neighbors had come. They'd brought food and quiet words and the particular careful expressions that people wear when they don't know what to say, but feel obligated to say something. Eleanor had thanked them. She had eaten a few bites of whatever they brought. She had nodded at the right moments and shaken her head at others. And then, one by one, the neighbors had stopped coming, because that is the nature of grief. In the beginning, everyone gathers, and then life resumes for everyone except the person who is left. And slowly the casseroles stop appearing on the porch, and the quiet visits fade, and you are alone with the fact of your loss in a way that nothing in the world can prepare you for. Eleanor had survived it by working. She'd always had skilled hands. Her mother had taught her to sew before she could read, and Thomas had added leatherwork to her repertoire during their early years of marriage, showing her how to punch holes cleanly, how to saddle stitch without the thread cutting into the leather, how to read the grain of a hide to understand where it would hold and where it would give. After he was gone, she had quietly converted the front room of their small house into a workspace. A wide wooden table, 2 oil lamps, her tools arranged along the wall on pegs she'd hammered in herself. She repaired saddles, bridles, harnesses. She mended quilts and coats. She fixed the strap on the schoolteacher's satchel and the broken hinge on the Reverend's Bible case. She charged fair prices, kept to herself, and did not ask for anything from anyone. The people of Black Hollow, in their quiet frontier way, respected this. They gave her work without pity and paid without fuss, and they left her alone, which was, Eleanor believed, the greatest kindness they could have offered. The candle was something else entirely. Every evening, just as the light failed, that particular hour when the sky went from orange to a deep bruised purple, and the first stars appeared uncertainly, like they weren't sure they'd been invited, Eleanor came out onto her porch and lit a single tallow candle. She set it on the railing and sat in the wooden chair beside it and let it burn for exactly 2 hours before she brought it inside. She had done this every night for 4 years, through rain and wind and 2 fierce winters when the cold was so savage that the candle guttered and nearly died, and she had cupped her hands around it to keep the flame alive. Nobody asked her about it. Even the boldest gossips in Black Hollow, and there were several, didn't dare. The candle was so clearly private, so obviously hers, that approaching it felt like walking into someone's bedroom without knocking. So people talked around it instead, the way they talked around everything about Eleanor. She's managing well, considering. That was the phrase they used, considering, as though her whole life had been filed under that single word. She was 34 years old, and she looked, on most days, like a woman who had made a firm peace with being tired. Well, it was the 3rd week of September when Gideon Hart rode into Black Hollow. He came in from the north, which already marked him as different. Most travelers came from the east or west, following the main road, but the northern trail was rougher country, used mostly by men who knew the mountains well, or men who had reasons to avoid the easier routes. Gideon appeared to be the former. He rode a big gray mare with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who spent more time on horseback than off it, and he wore dust the way most men wore a coat, like it belonged on him. He stopped first at the livery to see to his horse, which told you something about him right away. Hector Dunn, who ran the livery and had an opinion about everyone, watched the stranger unsaddle his mare with the kind of care that most men saved for their children, and decided the man was probably all right. "Passing through?" he asked, more out of habit than real curiosity. "Maybe," Gideon said. He ran his hand down the mare's near foreleg, checking, then stood up and looked around at the stable. "Work around here?" "Depends on what you do." "Ranch work, mostly. Some fence mending, some breaking if the outfit needs it." Hector squinted at him. "Try the Halford spread 2 miles east. Old man Halford's been short-handed since his 2 boys left. Much obliged." Gideon pulled a coin from his vest pocket and offered it for a night's board for the horse. Hector took it without argument and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and Gideon lifted his saddlebag off the rail and walked out into the afternoon light. He was not a large man, particularly medium height, lean through the shoulders, with the kind of build that suggested strength without announcing it. He had dark hair gone slightly long at the collar, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that wasn't quite handsome but was interesting to look at. Straight nose, slightly off-center from an old break. Brown eyes that settled on things quietly, without hurry. There was nothing about him that demanded attention, and he seemed, in the way of men who have spent much of their lives alone, entirely comfortable with that. He found a room at the boarding house run by Vera Cutler, a stout, efficient woman who charged reasonable rates and provided 3 meals a day and asked no personal questions, which suited him perfectly. He ate supper that first evening at the long table with Vera's 3 other boarders, a traveling dry goods salesman named Potts, who talked too much, a young man waiting for a land claim to process, and a retired schoolteacher from Kansas who had come west for her lungs and seemed uncertain whether the cure was working. Gideon said little beyond what politeness required, answered Potts's questions in brief, complete sentences that discouraged follow-up, and went to bed early. He got the job at Halford's the next morning. Old man Halford was exactly what his name suggested. Old, hard-worn, with hands like 2 pieces of boot leather, and the permanent squint of a man who'd spent 6 decades arguing with the sun. He had 4 horses that needed their behavior adjusted, 40 yards of fence that were leaning toward collapse, and a bunkhouse that wanted some basic carpentry. He looked Gideon over for about 30 seconds and said, $12 a month, and you bunk here if you want. I've got a room in town, Gideon said. Halford shrugged. Suit yourself. 7 days a week, though. I got no use for a man who worships his own rest. That's fine. Start Monday? I can start now if you show me the fence. Halford looked at him again, this time with something that might have been approval, and reached for his hat. Gideon had been in Black Hollow for 5 days when the saddle strap gave out. It wasn't catastrophic. A clean break on the near latigo, probably the result of a small hidden crack in the leather that had been working itself open for months. He noticed it after a long day at Halford's, pulling the saddle off the gray mare in the fading afternoon light, and he held the broken strap in his hands for a moment, measuring the problem. He could jury-rig something to get by, but that was the kind of solution that bred bigger problems down the road. He needed proper repair. He asked Vera at breakfast the next morning. Leatherwork? Vera set a plate of eggs in front of him without looking up. Eleanor Mercer does leatherwork. House at the end of Milliken Street, the one with the... She paused, seemed to consider something, and then continued. You'll know it. Only one on the street with a workshop light burning at all hours. She any good? Vera looked at him directly then, which she rarely did with her boarders. She's the best in the county, she said. Probably better than that. Don't let the... Another pause. Just don't be stupid about it. She's a private woman. Get your work done, pay your bill, and keep your opinions to yourself. It was an unusual amount of warning to offer about a leatherworker, and Gideon noted it without commenting. He thanked her and finished his eggs, and that afternoon, after his shift at Halford's, he slung the broken saddle over one shoulder and walked down Milliken Street. He almost missed the house. It sat at the very end of the road, slightly apart from its neighbors, with a front porch that needed painting and a garden that had been let go long enough to look intentional. The kind of wildness that happens when someone stops caring about appearances, but the yard has enough sun and decent soil to go on thriving regardless. There was a small sign nailed beside the door, Mercer Repair, leather, textile, tack. Below it, someone had added in different, smaller letters, please knock, no exceptions. He knocked, a silence that was not quite empty. He could hear movement inside, the scrape of a stool, the soft sound of something being set down with deliberate care. Then footsteps, slow and unhurried. The door opened. Eleanor Mercer was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what he had expected. She was of medium height, with dark hair pulled back into a practical knot that was losing the argument with several escaped strands. She wore a canvas apron over a plain work dress, and there was a smear of leather oil on her left forearm and another on her chin that she clearly hadn't noticed. Her eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray that sat somewhere between storm cloud and still water, and they looked at him with the calm, slightly removed assessment of someone who had gotten very good at not being surprised by anything. "Help you?" she said. Not unfriendly, not the opposite of unfriendly, simply direct. "Yes, ma'am." He shifted the saddle in his arms. Latigo strap broke. Vera Cutler said you might be able to fix it. Eleanor looked at the saddle, not at him. She reached out and turned the broken end of the strap over in her fingers with the quiet expertise of someone who had done this 1,000 times, examining the break, running her thumb along the edge of the leather. "Dry rot at the core," she said. "Rest of the strap looks sound, but I'd want to check the billet straps too before I say so for certain. This kind of thing usually doesn't happen alone." "Whatever you think is right." She glanced up at him briefly, seemed to make some internal assessment, and stepped back from the door. "Bring it in." He followed her inside through a short hallway that smelled of leather and oil and something faintly herbal he couldn't identify, and into the front room. The workshop was not what the exterior of the house suggested. Outside, the house looked like a place that had given up. Inside, this room was something else entirely, organized with a kind of fierce precision that spoke of someone who had decided to pour all of her care into one thing and had done it completely. Tools hung on the wall in ascending order of size, each on its own peg, each clean and oiled. The wide work table was scarred from years of use, but swept free of debris. Spools of thread in various weights and colors were arranged in a wooden rack near the window. 2 oil lamps hung above the table, positioned for maximum light. In the corner, a small iron stove radiated quiet warmth against the autumn chill. Gideon set the saddle on the table when Eleanor gestured for him to do so, and he watched her work through it methodically, checking each strap, each ring, each point of stress. She said nothing for several minutes, and he said nothing either, which he suspected was either unusual or entirely usual for her customers. He couldn't tell which. "You're new," she said finally, without looking up. "Just over a week." "Halford's?" "That's right." She nodded, still examining the billet straps, running her fingers along the stitching. He works his hands hard. That's fair. A brief silence, then, I can have the latigo replaced by Friday. If the billet straps need work too, and this one is close, I'd say Saturday to be safe. Saturday's fine. $2, even if it's just the latigo. $2.50 if the billets need anything. That's fair, he said again, which made her glance up at him one more time with that same measured look. Name for the ticket? She asked, pulling a small ledger from a shelf beneath the table. Gideon Hart. She wrote it down in neat, economical letters. I'll have it ready Saturday by noon. He thanked her. She walked him back to the door without ceremony, and he walked back up Milliken Street in the thickening dusk. And that was the whole of their first meeting. 20 minutes, maybe less. Practical and unremarkable in every way. Except that when he reached the corner and turned, some instinct made him look back down the street toward her house. The porch was lit. He hadn't noticed the candle on the way in. It hadn't been there. But now a small flame burned steadily on the porch railing, remarkable not for its size but for its quality of light. The way it held itself still and strong against the evening breeze in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like it was trying. He stood there a moment longer than he intended, watching it. Then he kept walking. Over the following days, he noticed things without meaning to. He noticed that the candle appeared every evening at the same time, just at the turn of dark, reliable as a clock, and burned for exactly the same duration before the porch went dark again. He noticed this because Milliken Street was on his route back from Halford's, and he had no particular reason to choose a different way, and he was not a man who invented reasons to do things differently when the current way was working fine. He noticed that Eleanor had 2 customers he could observe from the street. An older woman he later learned was the schoolteacher, who came on Tuesdays with quilts, and a rancher's wife who came on Thursdays with various items wrapped in brown paper. Beyond these, the house was quiet. The workshop light burned at all hours. He'd heard Vera say it, and he'd seen it for himself. A pale orange glow in the window on evenings when he passed. But the social noise that surrounded most houses in a small town simply was not there. No visitors lingering on the porch, no casual conversation shouted across the fence. Just work and that nightly candle, and the particular silence of a woman who had made her peace with solitude. Or who was still in the process of making it, which was a different thing entirely. He thought about Vera's warning. He thought about the way Eleanor had looked at the saddle before she'd looked at him. He thought about the workshop, its fierce, meticulous order, and the iron stove in the corner keeping that one room warm, while, he suspected, the rest of the house stayed cold. He was not a man who thought about strangers as a rule. He moved through the world attentively, but with a certain reserve, keeping the distance that years of working transient ranch jobs had taught him was appropriate. You didn't form attachments to places you were already planning to leave. You didn't invest in people whose names you wouldn't remember by the following spring. That was the unspoken code of the ranch hand's life, and Gideon had lived by it comfortably for long enough that it had stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like just the shape of things. Still, he thought about that candle. Saturday morning brought clouds, the low gray ceiling that preceded the autumn rains, and Gideon walked down Milliken Street at 11:50 with the particular efficiency of a man who had places to be and wasn't using them as an excuse. He knocked, waited the same span of silence as before. The door opened. Eleanor looked different in the morning light, or maybe he was paying closer attention this time. The same practical knot, the same canvas apron, but she had a small cut on her left index finger that had been wrapped with a piece of cloth, and her eyes were slightly shadowed in a way that said she'd either slept poorly or started work before dawn, possibly both. "Mr. Hart," she said, which surprised him slightly. He hadn't expected her to remember his name. "Morning, ma'am." "Saddle's ready." She stepped back and he followed her into the workshop again. The saddle sat in the center of the table, and the work she'd done was immediately visible even to an untrained eye. The new latigo strap was perfectly matched to the existing leather in both color and weight. The stitching was dense and even, and she'd treated the entire saddle with oil that had brought up the color and softened what had started to go stiff. It looked, improbably, better than it had before the strap broke. "Billets were fine," she said. "Needed some conditioning but no structural repair, so it's $2. He examined the work for a moment without pretending not to. "This is better than I paid for." "The conditioning was quick," she said, with the slight dismissive tone of someone who did not particularly want to be thanked. It needed it. He paid her $2.50 piece, and when she started to make change, he shook his head. For the conditioning. She looked at the coins in her palm for a moment. Then she put them in the shallow tin box on the shelf without comment, and he noted that she didn't argue, which told him she wasn't one for performative refusing of fair payment. He respected that. Good work, he said, picking up the saddle. It'll hold, she said, which was, he sensed, her version of the same thing. He walked back to the door, and she followed, and he was on the porch and almost down the steps when he heard something behind him that stopped him. Not a word or a cry, but a sound he recognized from long experience. The specific soft landing of a person sitting down hard when they didn't intend to. He turned. Eleanor was on the porch floor, her back against the doorframe, and the look on her face was not pain exactly, but something past it. The blank, gone expression of someone whose body had stopped cooperating and hadn't consulted them first. Her color was wrong. Not pale in the way of cold or shock, but pale in the way of something that had been building for longer than a single morning. "Ma'am?" He was back on the porch in 2 steps, setting the saddle aside without thinking, crouching in front of her. "What happened?" "I'm fine," she said, automatic as breathing. Her voice was steady enough, but her hands on the porch boards were trembling faintly. "You don't look fine." "I just got up too fast." He looked at her eyes, at the color of her lips, at the way she was holding herself very still with the concentration of someone trying not to tip over. "How long have you been feeling this way?" "I'm fine, Mr. Hart." The tone was not angry. It was something colder and more specific than anger. It was the tone of someone who had spent years managing their own problems alone and did not intend to start accepting help from a near stranger on a Saturday morning. He recognized it because he'd used it himself often enough to know exactly where it came from. "All right," he said, pulling back slightly, not retreating but giving her space. "Is there anything in the house you need before I go? Water, something like that?" A pause, the kind that said she was weighing something. "There's a pitcher on the kitchen table," she said finally. He went inside and found the pitcher and a cup and brought them back and put them on the porch railing within her reach, and then he picked up the saddle and walked to the end of the porch steps and stopped there with his back to her and his eyes on the street. "Who do you want me to tell?" he asked. Another silence. This one longer. "Tell? If it gets worse, who should I let know?" He heard the sound of water being poured, the small, careful sound of drinking. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted by some small, almost imperceptible degree, like a door opening exactly 1 inch. "Vera Cutler," she said. "Or Margaret Hale at the general store." He nodded. "I'll check the general store's open." He didn't say I'll let her know. He didn't say I'll keep an eye. He just walked away up Milliken Street with the saddle over his shoulder, and at the top of the road he turned into the general store, and he found Margaret Hale behind the counter, and he said simply and directly that Eleanor Mercer on Milliken Street appeared unwell and might need someone to look in on her, and he said it without drama and without detail, and Margaret Hale looked at him sharply and took off her apron. "How bad?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly, but she sat down when she didn't plan to. Margaret was already coming around the counter. "I know what that means with her," she said, with the tone of someone who'd been waiting for a reason to go. "I've been worried about her for weeks. She's been pushing herself since August, and she doesn't eat like she ought to. She'll take help better if you don't mention I said anything," Gideon said. Margaret stopped and looked at him again with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're very quiet about this for someone who's been in town 10 days, she said. "I just got my saddle fixed," he said, and walked out. He did not go back to Milliken Street for 6 days. He told himself this was because there was no reason to. He had his saddle, his work at Halford's was demanding enough to fill his days fully, and Eleanor Mercer was not his concern. Margaret Hale had gone to check on her. The town would do what small towns did when one of their own was down, whatever they thought of her solitude. It was not his business. He told himself this and largely believed it, and still found himself on the 6th evening at the end of Milliken Street watching the candle burn. It was back. It had come back 3 days after he'd last seen it. Margaret had mentioned it in passing when he'd stopped in the general store for tobacco, not to him directly, but to another customer, with the unmistakable relief of a woman reporting good news. "Eleanor's up and about. I saw her candle last night. The other customer had simply nodded as though this were a known language, a specific sign they all understood. He stood at the corner for a minute, maybe two, watching the steady flame in the darkening air, and then he turned and walked back to the boarding house and ate Vera's supper without tasting most of it. He went back at the end of the following week. He had a reason this time. A leather punch he'd borrowed from the tack room at Halford's had cracked along the handle, and Halford had suggested, with typical economy of words, that he see about getting it fixed rather than replaced if possible. It was a genuine errand. He was aware it was also a convenient one. Eleanor answered the door looking entirely recovered, which was to say, she looked exactly as she had the first time he'd come, which was to say tired but functioning. She looked at him, and then at the punch he held out, and then at him again, briefly. "Handle's cracked," he said. "I can see that." She took it from him and turned it over. "Halford's? How'd you know? He's had that punch for 15 years and he treats his tools like they owe him something." She examined the crack, pressing gently with her thumb. "I can put a leather wrap on it and pin it. Won't be as good as new, but it'll hold another 10 years if he stops being rough about it. I'll pass that along." "Don't," she said. "He'll just get defensive. Come back Thursday." He came back Thursday. The punch was ready, the repair clean and tight, and he paid what she asked and was leaving when she said, without preamble and without particular warmth, but without coldness either, "You told Margaret Hale to come check on me." It wasn't quite a question. He turned around. "I mentioned you seemed unwell," he said carefully. "You thought correctly," she said. "I'm not complaining." A pause. "I'm saying thank you, that's all." He nodded once. She nodded once. It was not a moment of warmth or connection, particularly. It was two practical people acknowledging a fact. But something about the directness of it, the refusal of both of them to make it into more than it was, felt cleaner than warmth might have. "You're welcome," he said, and went back down the steps. He was 10 feet down the path when she said, behind him, "You didn't ask me about the candle." He stopped, didn't turn immediately, thought for a second about what to say, and decided that the truth was the simplest thing. "No," he said, "I didn't." Another pause, this one longer. "Most people do," she said. Her voice had shifted again, that 1-inch door, almost imperceptible. "Eventually." "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to," he said. He heard her exhale. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. Something between the two, something that sounded almost like relief. He walked back up Milliken Street, and behind him, the door closed, and the afternoon went on around him the way afternoons did, indifferent to the small, unremarkable things that sometimes changed everything. He did not know yet that this was one of those. That evening, walking back from Halford's in the last red light of the day, he passed Milliken Street and slowed without meaning to. The candle was already lit. He was a few minutes earlier than usual, and the sky still held some color. The flame was barely visible against the pale dusk. But it was there, burning with its particular steadiness, and Eleanor was in the chair beside it, her hands in her lap, her face turned toward the mountains. She did not look peaceful. That was the thing he noticed and would keep noticing. The word people used for women who sat quietly and gazed at distances was always peaceful, as though stillness was the same thing as rest. But what he saw in Eleanor Mercer's face, from the distance of the street in the fading light, was not peace. It was work. The hard, invisible work of people who have decided to keep going even when the reasons for going are not entirely clear, who choose the next day and then the next. Not because it is easy, but because the alternative is a kind of darkness, they have decided, without ceremony or announcement, to refuse. He did not know her story yet. He knew almost nothing about her, really. The workshop, the tools, the candle, the brief and careful words she'd offered him across a work table. But he recognized that look. He'd worn it himself in the years after his brother died on a ranch in Colorado, when he'd spent months moving from job to job, carrying a weight he couldn't name, and talking to almost no one, and telling himself that the movement was the point, that staying still would mean having to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. He hadn't talked to anyone about his brother. He just worked and moved and worked again, and slowly, the way seasons changed, without drama or announcement, the sharpest edges of the grief had worn down to something he could live beside. He understood this about Eleanor Mercer, without knowing anything specific about her. He understood it in the way you understand things that live in the body rather than the mind, not through thinking, but through recognition. He stood at the corner for a moment. He did not wave. She did not turn. Then he walked on, and the evening closed behind him, and somewhere at the end of Milliken Street, a small candle burned steadily against the coming dark, patient as a promise no one had made out loud. Not yet. The week after his visit with the leather punch, Gideon fell into a routine without deciding to. It happened the way most things happened in his life, not through planning but through repetition, one day following the next until the pattern was already established before he'd noticed he was making one. He worked at Halford's from first light until the afternoon stiffened into early dusk, rode the gray mare back to town along the same road, stabled her at Hector's livery, and walked back to Vera's boarding house by way of Milliken Street. He told himself it was simply the most direct route. This was not entirely a lie. The candle was always there when he passed, always the same hour, always the same railing, always that same quality of light he'd noticed the first time. Steady and deliberate, as though the flame itself had made a decision to keep burning and saw no reason to revisit it. Eleanor was not always on the porch. Some evenings the chair was empty and the candle burned alone. And on those nights there was something about the unattended flame that felt even more private than the sight of her sitting beside it, like he'd walked past a moment that wasn't meant for witnesses. He kept walking those nights with his eyes forward and his pace unchanged. Other evenings she was there, sitting with her hands in her lap, or with some small piece of mending, and once with a cup of something hot that steamed in the cooling air. She never looked up when he passed. He never stopped. The acknowledgement between them, if it could be called that, was entirely internal. Just the awareness, on both sides, that the other was there, like two people sitting on opposite ends of a long bench, pretending to read, both knowing the bench was the point. October came in cold that year, with a bite in the air that arrived a full 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected and settled into the bones of the town like it intended to stay. The mountains to the north disappeared behind a curtain of early cloud, and the cottonwoods along the creek dropped their leaves in a single hard week, going from gold to bare almost overnight. And the people of Black Hollow began the particular frontier ritual of calculating whether they had enough firewood and deciding, almost always, that they did not. Gideon was splitting logs behind Halford's bunkhouse on a Tuesday afternoon when the old man came out and leaned against the fence post and watched him work with the expression he used for most things, which was mild suspicion. "You gonna stay on through winter?" Halford asked. Gideon paused between swings. He thought about it genuinely, which was more than he usually did. For the past several years, winter had always been the season when he moved, headed south to warmer outfits, or into towns with enough indoor work to carry him through until spring. He was not a man who settled. He'd known that about himself for long enough that it no longer felt like a flaw. "Maybe," he said, which was, for him, farther toward yes than he'd been in a long time. Halford grunted and went back inside, satisfied with that, or indifferent to it. Gideon couldn't tell. He went back to splitting wood and tried not to think too carefully about why he'd said it. It was the following Thursday when the situation with Dale Cutter happened. Gideon had finished early at Halford's. One of the horses he'd been working with had needed to be given the day easy after going slightly lame the previous afternoon, and without that work filling his afternoon, he'd found himself riding back into town by 2 o'clock, which was unusual enough that Hector commented on it when he handed over the mare. "Half day?" Hector said. "Horse needed rest." "You could have rested too." "I don't rest well," Gideon said, which was true enough. He was passing the general store when he heard it. Not loud, but the particular quality of a voice kept deliberately low by someone who didn't want the sound to carry. The kind of low that was its own kind of threat. He slowed without stopping, and through the open door of the store, he caught enough to understand what was happening before he'd fully processed the decision to go in. Margaret Hale was behind the counter, and she had the look of a woman watching something she didn't know how to stop. Eleanor was standing at the counter with a canvas satchel she'd apparently just delivered, 3 or 4 pieces of repaired tack, from the look of what was spread on the counter, and across from her was Dale Cutter, who ran a mid-sized spread northeast of town and had a reputation in Black Hollow that was, depending on who you asked, either that of a hard but fair man, or a man who was only fair when he thought someone was watching. Dale was watching Eleanor right now with the loose, confident expression of a man who had decided that the outcome of this conversation was already determined and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. I'm telling you what it's worth to me, he was saying when Gideon pushed through the door. Not to you. What it's worth to me is $1.20. The rest is your opinion of yourself, and I'm not in the business of paying for opinions. Eleanor had her hands flat on the counter, very still. The bill is $2, she said. Same as I quoted you 3 weeks ago when you brought the work in. I don't change my prices after the job is done. Well, I'm changing what I'm willing to pay. Dale's voice stayed pleasant, which was the worse version of the thing. A man who yelled was just angry. A man who stayed pleasant while taking something from you was something else. You can argue about it, or you can take $1.20, and we can both go about our afternoon. I know you need the money, Eleanor. The way he said her name. Gideon had been in enough difficult rooms to know what that tone was. The casual use of a person's given name to remind them of the distance between their positions, as though the familiarity was itself a kind of ownership. He walked to the counter and stood beside Eleanor. Not in front of her, beside her, which was a specific choice. And he set his hands on the counter and looked at Dale Cutter. Problem? He said. Just the one word. Dale looked at him with the mild irritation of a man whose chess game has been interrupted. This is a private business matter. It's happening in a public store, Gideon said reasonably. He didn't change his tone and he didn't shift his weight. He just stood there, quiet and even, the way a fence post stands in a field. Not threatening, simply immovable. How much is she owed? $2, Eleanor said. $2 is the bill, Gideon said, looking at Dale. Sounds like it's been the bill since she took the work. You have an issue with the quality? A pause. Dale looked at the tack on the counter. He knew the quality was fine. It was obvious to anyone with eyes. I have an issue with the price, he said, but the pleasant tone had shifted slightly, the way a road shifts when you realize the surface underfoot is less solid than it looked. The price was agreed, Gideon said, before the work was done. He waited. So that's not really an issue with the price. That's something else. The something else hung in the air between them, perfectly clear to everyone in the room and none of them willing to name it directly. Dale Cutter was not a physical coward, particularly. Gideon had asked around enough to know the man wasn't someone who backed down easily. But backing down from a loud confrontation was one thing. Standing in a general store in front of Margaret Hale and a quiet, level-eyed stranger and defending the position that you were going to pay a widow woman less than she was owed because you felt like it, that was a different thing. That required you to hear yourself out loud. Dale picked up the tack pieces from the counter one by one, slowly. He reached into his coat and put $2 on the counter without looking at Eleanor. Fine, he said, and his voice was smooth and flat as poured concrete. He looked at Gideon directly. I don't know who you are. Gideon Hart, he said. I'll remember that. That's fine, Gideon said. Dale Cutter left. The door swung shut behind him, and the three of them, Gideon, Eleanor, and Margaret, who had not breathed properly in several minutes, stayed where they were for a moment in the particular quiet that follows the end of something unpleasant. Margaret let out a long breath. That man, she said, in the tone of someone who had a great deal more to say and was choosing not to say it in front of company. Eleanor picked up the $2 from the counter and folded them once and put them in her apron pocket. Her hands were steady. Her face was the careful, closed face she wore by default in public, the one that didn't show things, but her jaw was set in a way that said something was working beneath the surface, working hard. Thank you, she said, and it took Gideon a second to realize she was talking to him. She was looking at the counter when she said it, not at him. You had it handled, he said. I didn't, she said quietly. It was said without self-pity, without complaint, just the flat acknowledgement of fact. I don't have it handled when it's Dale Cutter. He knows I don't. She looked up then briefly, and there was something raw in her eyes before she put it away. I've been letting him underpay me for 2 years. The confession seemed to surprise her more than anyone else. She pressed her lips together and picked up her empty canvas satchel from the counter. I appreciate it, she said, more formally, retreating back behind the careful voice. I mean that. He nodded. She walked to the door and he watched her go, and Margaret came around from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who had just witnessed something she intended to think about for several days. 2 years, she said softly, after the door had closed. She shook her head. She never said a word. She's saying it now, Gideon said, and went to pick up the tobacco he'd come in for. Oh. It was 3 days later, on a Sunday evening when Halford gave his hands the afternoon, that Eleanor knocked on his door at Vera's boarding house. He almost didn't recognize her out of context. He'd seen her only in the workshop or on the porch or behind the counter at the general store, places that had their own specific geometry to them, where she fit exactly. Standing in the hallway of Vera's boarding house in a clean, dark dress, with her hair more carefully arranged than usual, she looked simultaneously more formal and younger than he'd understood her to be. And he registered this with the slight disorientation of seeing a word you know well spelled out in unfamiliar handwriting. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mrs.," she said automatically, and then something shifted in her face. "Mercer is fine," she said. "All right." A pause in which neither of them spoke, and he had the impression she had rehearsed something and lost it on the way over. "I wanted to say thank you properly," she said finally. "What you did with Dale, the way you did it." She stopped. Most men would have... She seemed to search for words and not quite find them. It would have been worse with most men. It could have turned into something. "It didn't need to," he said simply. "I know. That's what I'm thanking you for." She looked at the floor for a moment and then back up at him with the slightly braced expression of someone about to do something they've decided to do but aren't sure about. "Would you want to come to supper? Tonight. Nothing elaborate. I'm making beans and I have cornbread, and that's the honest extent of it." Gideon looked at her. He was aware of Vera somewhere in the vicinity of the kitchen, going about her business with the light-footed loudness of someone making clear they were not listening. "Beans and cornbread sounds fine," he said. 7 o'clock, Eleanor said, and left before she could change her mind. He arrived at 7 and she opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been listening for him, a fact neither of them acknowledged. She led him through the hallway, past the workshop with its glowing lamps and its order that he was starting to understand was armor, and into the kitchen at the back of the house, which was smaller and warmer and considerably more imperfect than the front room. A pan left soaking in the basin, a dish towel folded slightly wrong on its hook, a small stack of papers on the corner of the table that she swept away quickly when he came in. The table was set for two. Simple. 2 plates, 2 cups, the beans on the stove smelling of salt pork and rosemary, the cornbread in a cast-iron pan on the trivet. A small oil lamp in the center of the table threw everything in warm orange shadow. He hung his coat on the hook she indicated and sat where she pointed, and she served the food with efficient, unceremonious movements, and they were eating before they had said anything more to each other, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't, particularly. "You've been here about 6 weeks," she said. It wasn't a question. "About that. You're staying through winter." "Probably." He looked up. "Why?" She shrugged, spooning beans. "Vera mentioned it. She notices things." A pause. "You're different from the usual type that works Halfords." "What's the usual type?" "Young and stupid, mostly. Boys who think ranching is romantic until January." She said it without cruelty, just the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who had observed the world long enough to categorize it accurately. "You're not young or stupid." "Thank you," he said, which made something at the corner of her mouth move, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the ghost of one, the first he'd seen from her. "Where'd you come from?" she asked. "Originally, Kansas. And before here?" "Colorado, before that Wyoming, before that a ranch in Nebraska." He ate. "I move around." "Why?" He considered the honest answer. "It's easier," he said. "Moving. You don't have to decide about things." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. "I can't decide if that's cowardly or practical," she said. "Probably both," he said. This time the corner of her mouth moved and stayed moved, just briefly, just barely enough to call a smile if you were generous about it. She looked back at her plate, but she didn't put it away. They talked about horses for a while, specifically about the mare he rode, who was a quarter horse with Morgan blood and an opinion about everything, and Eleanor, who had grown up around horses before she'd come to Black Hollow, had detailed in specific opinions about Morgan horses in general that she delivered with an unexpected animation, gesturing once with her spoon in a way that seemed to surprise her. She caught herself and put the spoon down and sat back slightly. "Sorry," she said. I don't usually. She stopped. Talk? He said. That much. She picked her spoon back up. It's been a while. He understood she didn't mean a few weeks. He understood she meant years. He didn't say so, just went back to his beans, and she went back to hers. And after a moment, she picked up the thread of the horses again, more carefully this time, but she picked it up. They talked about the leather work too, not the business of it, but the craft, the actual physical work of it, what she liked about it, and what was difficult. She told him about a saddle she'd rebuilt the previous year from what was essentially a broken frame, taking it all the way down to the tree and starting over. And the way she described it, the problem-solving of it, the patience required, the satisfaction when the finished thing held exactly as it should, it was the most animated he'd seen her. Her hands moved. Her eyes were lit with something specific and genuine that was, he realized, simply what she looked like when she forgot to be careful. He didn't rush the conversation or try to extend it. He just stayed where he was, eating the beans, which were good, and letting her talk when she wanted to and fall quiet when she needed to, and the lamp burned low without either of them noticing. When the plates were empty, she got up to clear them, and he stood to help, and she said, "You don't have to," in a tone that was halfway to accepting that he was going to anyway. "I know," he said, and picked up his plate. She washed, he dried, which was either entirely natural or deeply strange, depending on how you looked at it, given that they had spoken a cumulative total of perhaps 40 minutes across all their previous encounters. But the strangeness, if it existed, stayed outside the kitchen. In here it was just the sound of water and the clink of dishes and the small domestic rhythm of two people finishing a meal together. "The cornbread was good," he said. "I burned the bottom a little. It was still good." She glanced at him sideways, briefly, then back at the pan she was scrubbing. "You're very even," she said. "What?" "Even. You don't—" She paused, thinking. "A lot of people get loud when they're trying to be kind, like they need you to know how kind they're being." She handed him a wet pan to dry. "You don't do that." He didn't know what to say to that exactly, so he dried the pan. "Thomas was like that," she said quietly, and then went still for a moment, her hands in the water like she'd said something she hadn't planned to and needed a second to determine whether she was all right with it. He waited. "My husband," she said. "He died 4 years ago, he and our son." She said it the way people say things they have said many times, but never to people they intended to keep, with the flatness of repetition, but underneath it something fragile that the repetition hadn't entirely managed to protect. "I know," he said. "I didn't know the details, but I knew something." "From who?" "Nobody told me," he said. He set down the pan. "I recognized it, the way you are." She turned and looked at him then, fully, for the first time since he'd arrived. Really looked at him, with the careful, assessing look she usually reserved for leather she was trying to understand. "You've lost someone too," she said. Not a question. "My brother. 7 years ago." She nodded once, turned back to the basin. They finished the dishes in silence, the comfortable kind of silence that meant something had been said that didn't need to be expanded on. When he put on his coat at the door, she stood in the hallway, and he noticed she was turning something over in her hands without seeming to know she was doing it. A small piece of leather cord, twisted and untwisted around her fingers, something she must have had in her apron pocket. "The candle," she said abruptly. He went still. "It was something Thomas did," she said to the middle distance. "Every evening, he'd light it, and we'd sit on the porch and he'd read to Jacob, our boy, until it was time for bed. Every night, rain or cold, didn't matter. Jacob loved it." Her fingers kept moving with the cord. "After they were gone, I kept doing it because I didn't know how to stop. And then I kept doing it because I didn't want to stop." She finally looked at him. "I know people think I think it's the right thing to do," he said. She blinked. He had the impression that was not what she'd expected him to say. She'd been braced for something more complicated, some careful sympathy, some gentle suggestion that healing required letting go. "I think holding on to the things that mattered is the right thing to do," he said. "Not instead of living, but with it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the night was very quiet, the way frontier nights were quiet. Not empty, but full of the sounds of things that didn't have names for human problems. "Good night, Mr. Hart," she said. "Gideon," he said. The pause before she responded was exactly 3 seconds long, and he counted them without knowing why. "Good night, Gideon," she said, and closed the door. He walked back up Milliken Street, and behind him the candle burned on the porch railing, 2 hours left in its vigil, steady against the cold October dark. He didn't look back this time. He didn't need to. He could feel it. The supper on Sunday became 2 suppers, then 3, then a pattern so gradual that neither of them could have said exactly when it stopped being an occasional thing and became simply the shape of their weeks. It was never planned in advance, which was perhaps why it worked. Eleanor didn't extend invitations so much as she left a door slightly ajar. A comment at the end of a transaction about having extra stew, a mention that she'd made too much bread again, the kind of thing a person could walk through or not, and no damage done either way. Gideon walked through it every time, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked aloud. October deepened. The cold moved from the air into the ground, and the ground hardened and the days shortened down to the kind of pale gray light that made the afternoons feel like early evening even at 3 o'clock. Halford's work shifted from outdoor tasks to the slower, heavier work of winter preparation, reinforcing the barn walls, laying in feed, checking and rechecking the structural integrity of outbuildings that had to survive whatever the mountains sent down. It was the kind of work Gideon was suited for, methodical and physical, requiring patience more than speed. He was good at patience. He hadn't always been, but the years had made him so, the way years tended to make you into the thing you needed most. He'd started helping Eleanor with her work almost by accident. The first time, it was genuinely practical. He'd arrived for supper one Tuesday to find her struggling alone with the large ranch saddle that needed to be held in precise position while she stitched the cantle binding, a job that required 3 hands at minimum, and she had 2. She'd looked up when he came in, assessed the situation without sentiment, and said, "Hold this right here," pointing to the exact spot on the saddle tree. He'd held it. She'd stitched. The job was done in 20 minutes that would have taken her over an hour alone, and she'd said, "Thank you, sit down," with the efficiency of a woman putting tools back on their pegs, and that was the whole of it. The second time was when a large order came in from a cattle operation 2 towns over. 6 bridles needing complete overhaul, brought by wagon and left in a stack that reached Eleanor's shoulder. She'd looked at it the way a person looks at a mountain they intend to climb and aren't sure they have time for, and when Gideon came on Thursday evening, she'd been working for 3 hours already, her back stiff, 2 bridles done, and 4 still waiting. He sat down across from her at the workbench without asking and picked up a bridle and said, "What needs doing first on these?" She'd looked at him for a moment. "You don't know leather work. Teach me the parts I can do." She'd taught him to clean and condition, which didn't require skill so much as attention and patience. He conditioned while she stitched, and they worked side by side for 2 hours in a silence that was interrupted occasionally by her correcting his technique. More even, "You're pressing too hard on that side." And as asking questions she answered without looking up from her work. And outside the window the night was fully dark, and the candle on the porch was lit, and neither of them mentioned it. By the time the order was done, spread across 3 evenings, which was half the time it would have taken Eleanor alone, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing about this was dramatic. But the workshop, which had been strictly her space, her private refuge, had quietly expanded to include him. And she had let it happen, and she was still determining what she thought about that. He could tell she was determining it. She was not a woman who made peace with things quickly. She turned them over, examined them from several angles, looked for the weak points the way she looked for stress fractures in old leather. He didn't rush her. Rushing Eleanor Mercer would have been like trying to hurry the season, pointless and likely to make things worse. What he did instead was show up consistently and behave exactly the same way every time, which was the only thing he knew how to offer, and which turned out, in this particular case, to be exactly enough. November arrived, and with it the first real snow of the season. Not a blizzard, just a quiet overnight snowfall that left 4 inches on the ground and turned Black Hollow into the kind of temporary prettiness that frontier people appreciated and did not trust. Gideon woke to it, looked at it from Vera's window, and thought about Eleanor's porch and whether she'd had enough firewood laid in, and then felt slightly ridiculous for thinking it, and went to breakfast. He asked Vera about it anyway, because asking Vera was easier than the alternative. Eleanor Mercer's firewood, he said. She's set for winter? Vera poured his coffee with the particular composure of a woman who was not going to make any comment she couldn't take back. She gets a cord delivered in September, she said. Whether a cord is enough for her place, I couldn't say. It wasn't enough, as it turned out. He found this out not by asking Eleanor, but by noticing the way she kept the workshop stove burning but let the kitchen go cold. He'd noticed it on Tuesday when he'd gone back to get his coat, and the kitchen was noticeably colder than the front room. When he mentioned it, she waved a hand and said there was plenty of wood. It was just efficient not to heat rooms you weren't actively in. This was a lie delivered with perfect composure, and he pretended to believe it. And the following morning he arranged with Hector Dunn, who knew everyone's practical business in Black Hollow, for another half cord to be delivered to Eleanor's woodpile, paying for it himself and asking Hector to simply say it had been a delivery error if Eleanor questioned it. Hector had looked at him with the mildly entertained expression of a man who had seen every variation of this particular situation. You know she'll figure it out, he said. Probably, Gideon said, but not until it's already there. Hector had delivered the wood. Eleanor had said nothing to Gideon about it, which meant she'd figured it out and decided to let it go, which meant something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. What he could say was that the kitchen was warmer after that, on the evenings when he came. The evenings when he came. He'd started thinking of them that way, as a fixed point in the week's geography, the way you think of a landmark. He didn't examine this too carefully. He was still, in the back of his mind, operating on the assumption that this was temporary, that spring would come and he'd move on, the way he always moved on, and this would become one of the places he'd worked and the people he'd known briefly and remembered occasionally with the mild fondness that distance provided. He kept that assumption because he didn't know what to do without it. But November was not spring, and in November, Black Hollow was the whole world, and Eleanor's workshop was the warmest room in it. They fell into a working rhythm that suited both of them, which is to say it was almost entirely wordless except when words were necessary. Eleanor directed, Gideon executed, and in between there was the companionable quiet of people who had discovered they could occupy the same silence without either of them feeling the need to fill it. He learned things by watching, how to punch a hole cleanly, how to thread a harness needle, how to feel the difference between leather that was just dry and leather that was beginning to crack from the inside. She corrected him when he got it wrong and said nothing when he got it right, which was its own kind of teaching. He got it right more often as the weeks went on. One night in the middle of November, they were finishing a particularly difficult order, a full horse collar that had been brought in badly damaged, the lining torn away, and the outer shell cracked in 2 places. And it was past 9 o'clock, and the lamp was burning low, and Eleanor was on her 3rd attempt at getting the inner seam to lie flat, and she was not saying anything, but her jaw was set, and her movements had the quality of someone holding on to their patience by a thread. Let me hold it, Gideon said. I've got it. Eleanor? She stopped, looked up at him. You've been fighting that seam for 40 minutes, he said. Let me hold it flat while you stitch. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to indicate that she was considering arguing further. Then she moved over on the bench and he sat beside her and pressed the seam flat with both hands and held it with steady, even pressure while she stitched. The needle moved cleanly, the thread pulled through without catching. In 8 minutes, the seam was done, lying exactly as it was supposed to lie, and she leaned back and looked at it with the critical eye of someone who wasn't going to admit it was right until she'd stared at it long enough to be certain. All right, she said quietly. That's right. Yeah. They sat there for a moment, both of them looking at the finished collar on the table. The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere. Outside, the wind had picked up, the particular winter wind that came off the mountains with an edge to it that could find every gap in a wall. You're good at holding things still, she said. He wasn't entirely sure she was talking about the leather. I've had practice, he said. She turned and looked at him, close range, the way you could only look at someone when you were sitting side by side on a narrow bench. She had oil on her hands and a thread callus on her right index finger, and her hair had come down on one side from the pins, and she was looking at him the way she looked at work she was trying to understand, seeking the grain of the thing, looking for where it would hold and where it would give. He didn't look away. You never ask me questions, she said. About Thomas? About Jacob? About any of it. I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know. Most people can't stand not asking. She looked back at the caller. They think they're being kind, but what they're really doing is satisfying their own curiosity and then calling it compassion. A pause. I've talked to more strangers about my dead son than I've talked to about him with people I actually trusted. The word trusted dropped into the room quietly. Neither of them moved. You can tell me, he said, if you want. I'm not asking, but you can tell me. She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved outside. The lamp held. Jacob was 6, she said finally, and her voice was different when she said his name, lower, rougher at the edges, as though the name itself had a texture she could feel. He was the kind of child who asked questions about everything. Not to be difficult, he just genuinely needed to understand how things worked. A brief sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't quite. He asked Thomas once why fire was hot, and Thomas spent 20 minutes explaining it, and Jacob listened to every word and then said, "But why, though?" Thomas about lost his mind. The not quite laugh again, this time a little closer to the real thing. He had Thomas's hands, big for his age, wide across the palm. I used to watch him try to help in the workshop and think, someday those hands are going to be good at something. She stopped. Gideon waited. He never got someday, she said. It was a simple sentence, stated simply, without performance. That was the most devastating thing about it. He didn't say he was sorry. He'd learned that I'm sorry was almost never what people needed in these moments. It redirected the conversation toward the speaker's feelings about the loss, rather than staying with the person who'd actually lost something. Instead, he said, "Tell me something else about him." She looked at him sharply, as if she'd expected the apology, and the pivot away from the subject that apologies usually signaled. What? Tell me something else, something small, something you remember. A silence. Then, almost tentatively, he couldn't whistle. He tried constantly. Thomas tried to teach him for months, and he just couldn't get the shape right. He'd sit there screwing up his face, absolutely furious about it, and produce this sad little sound like a sleepy bird. This time it was actually a laugh, small and quickly contained, like she wasn't sure she had permission for it, but genuine, fully genuine, in a way that changed her face entirely for the 2 or 3 seconds it lasted. Gideon felt something in his chest that he didn't try to name. He sounds like he was something, he said. He was everything, she said, simply, and without apology for it, and then she straightened up and started putting her tools in order, signaling, in the way she always signaled, that the open door was closing again for now. He respected it, as he always respected it. He helped her put the collar aside, covered it with the protective cloth, blew out the secondary lamp while she dealt with the tools. As he was pulling on his coat, she said, "To the wall, to the tools, to no particular point in the room. The candle is for the evenings, when Thomas used to read to him." She said it quickly, like crossing cold water, best done fast. "I light it at the same time he used to start reading. I let it burn as long as he used to read for. 2 hours, most nights." She finally looked at him. "That's what it is. I've never told anyone that." "I know," he said. "I mean, I didn't know the specifics, but I knew it was something like that." "How?" He thought about it honestly. "Because of how you guard it," he said. "People guard things the same way they love things, in proportion." She stared at him. He couldn't read what was happening behind her eyes exactly. It was too layered, too complicated for one word. But she didn't look away, and neither did he. "Good night, Gideon," she said. "Good night, Eleanor." He walked out into the cold, and behind him, through the front window of the workshop, the oil lamp went dark. On the porch, the candle was still burning, almost at the end of its 2 hours, the flame small but unhurried, doing what it had always done. He stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment in the cold and the dark, and he thought about Jacob, who had tried to whistle and never managed it, and about Thomas, who had spent 20 minutes explaining fire to a 6-year-old with enormous hands, and about Eleanor, who had been keeping vigil for 4 years for both of them, alone, in the cold, with such absolute fidelity that it had become the signature of her existence in this town. Not her grief, not her loneliness, but her love. The candle was never about loss. He understood that now. The candle was an act of love so stubborn it had refused to admit that death was a sufficient reason to stop. He walked home in the snow. His boots left clear tracks in the white, the only marks on the road. And he didn't look back, and he didn't try to think his way around the thing that was happening to him, because some things couldn't be thought around. They could only be walked into, one cold step at a time, and dealt with when you got there. He got back to Vera's boarding house, and he sat on his bed in the dark for a while, and he thought about moving on, about spring, about the ranches south of here, about the particular freedom of a man who didn't stay anywhere long enough to have anything to lose. He thought about it for a long time, and then he stopped thinking about it because the thinking wasn't doing anything useful anymore. He'd already made the decision somewhere in that workshop on that narrow bench, somewhere between holding a seam flat and the sound of Eleanor Mercer laughing for 2 seconds about a boy who couldn't whistle. He'd made it the way he made most real decisions, not with a moment of clarity, but with the slow understanding that something had already shifted, that the ground under his feet had changed while he was standing on it, and that the only thing left was to decide whether to pretend otherwise or to turn and face the new direction. He wasn't leaving in spring. He didn't know what that meant yet. He didn't know what she'd say or what she'd do or whether any of this was something she could receive, given everything she carried. He wasn't a man who mistook kindness for feeling or supper for a promise. He understood, with the specificity of someone who had been paying close attention, that Eleanor Mercer was not a woman who was anywhere near ready to be asked anything by anyone, and that pushing before the ground was solid would crack it entirely. But he wasn't leaving, that much he was sure of. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling in the dark, and listened to the wind work at the boarding house walls. And outside, somewhere in this frozen frontier town, a small candle was finishing its 2 hours on a porch railing, and the man who had lit his brother's memory the same way, privately, stubbornly, with no audience and no acknowledgement needed, was not moving on in spring. He was, for the first time in 7 years, staying. It was the bravest thing he'd done in a long time, and it looked like nothing from the outside. Just a man lying on a bed in a rented room in a cold frontier town, not going anywhere. That was the whole of it. That was enough. December came in hard. Not the gentle cinematic kind of winter that made people think of fireplaces and warm drinks, but the real frontier kind. The kind with wind that had been building speed across 200 miles of open plain before it hit Black Hollow and found no reason to slow down. The kind that crept under doors and through the gaps in window frames and made the town feel, in the worst of it, like a collection of small wooden boxes that the landscape was trying to shake apart. People kept to themselves in weather like this. They did what needed doing and got back inside, and the social rhythms of the town contracted to the essential. Vera's supper table got quieter. The general store filled up fast in the mornings and emptied out by noon. Even Halford's, where the indoor work kept going regardless, had a different quality to it. The men moved with their heads down and their words short, conserving energy the way animals did, understanding on some instinctual level that the cold required economy. Gideon worked. He was good in winter, better than in the easier seasons, in some ways. The cold simplified things. It stripped away the peripheral and left only what mattered. What mattered, he understood with increasing clarity, was the end of Milliken Street. He was honest with himself about it now. He'd stopped maintaining the fiction that this was temporary, that he was simply a passing figure in Eleanor's life who happened to share her workbench a few evenings a week. The decision he'd made lying on his bed in November had held through the weeks since, growing quieter and more settled the way convictions did when they were real. Not louder, not more urgent, just more completely present, like a stone that had found the bottom of a river and stopped moving. The town had noticed. Of course it had. Black Hollow was not large enough for two people to spend regular evenings together without the fact becoming part of the general knowledge. And once it was part of the general knowledge, it became part of the general conversation, which meant Gideon heard about it indirectly through the particular social telegraph of small places, a pause that lasted a beat too long at the livery, a comment from Vera that was shaped almost but not quite like a question, a look from Margaret Hale that managed to convey both approval and concern simultaneously, which was a considerable thing to fit into a single expression. He paid it no particular mind. He'd spent enough years in small towns to know that gossip moved fast and lost interest faster, and that the best response to it was to go about your business without adjustment in either direction, neither performing for the audience nor hiding from it. Eleanor had the same instinct, though hers came from a harder-won place. She had lived inside the town's attention for 4 years, been its subject of quiet pity and careful distance, and she had developed a complete immunity to it that was not indifference exactly, but something more like the kind of tolerance you build up through exposure. People talked, she worked. The work outlasted the talking every time. Still, there were moments when Gideon caught something in her face when they walked out of the general store together and passed the two women who stopped their conversation a half beat too late, a tightening at the corner of her mouth, a slight stiffening in her shoulders. Not shame, never shame, but the specific exhaustion of being someone else's topic, of having your private life treated as public property simply by virtue of the fact that other people could see it. One evening in mid-December, he arrived at the workshop to find her sitting at the workbench doing nothing. Just sitting, with her hands in her lap, and the work for the evening stacked and waiting beside her, and the look on her face that said she'd been thinking in circles and hadn't found the exit yet. He sat down across from her and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing. "Martha Gill asked me today," Eleanor said eventually, "whether you were boarding here now." He waited.
"She didn't say it meanly," Eleanor added, with the fairness she applied to everything. "She's not a mean woman, but she asked it the way people ask things when they want you to confirm what they've already decided." She looked at her hands. "I said no. That you came to help with work orders sometimes." "That's true," he said. "I know." A pause. "But it's not the whole truth of it, and I don't like saying things that aren't the whole truth." She looked up at him. "I'm not sure what the whole truth is exactly. That's the problem." It was, he thought, possibly the most direct she'd ever been with him about this, and it cost her something to say it. He could see that clearly. Eleanor didn't say uncertain things easily. She was a woman who dealt in what was solid and known, who built carefully from confirmed ground. "You don't have to know the whole truth right now," he said. "I know, but I'd like to." She met his eyes. "Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not asking you to. I'm not—" She stopped, regrouped. "I'm not good at this. I was good at it once, and then I wasn't, and I don't know how much of that I've recovered." "You don't have to be good at it," he said. "Neither do I. We can just be bad at it together." Something crossed her face. Not the almost smile he'd learned to watch for, but something quieter and more fundamental. A kind of relief, the way a door feels when the latch finally gives. "That's a terrible thing to promise someone," she said. "It's an honest one." She looked at him for a long moment, this woman who valued honesty above almost everything else, who had spent 4 years in the company of her own truth and no one else's, and he saw her weighing it with the same careful attention she brought to work that needed to hold under pressure. "All right," she said, finally. She reached out and picked up the top piece of work from the stack and set it on the table between them. "Hand me the number 4 punch." He handed her the number 4 punch and they went to work, and nothing else was said about it that evening, and nothing else needed to be. But something had changed. They both knew it. The door had moved. The week before Christmas, Gideon received a letter. It came through the post office in a plain envelope, and he recognized the handwriting before he saw the name. His old foreman from the ranch in Wyoming, a man named Beaumont, who ran a large operation and was not in the habit of writing letters unless he wanted something specific. Gideon read it at Vera's breakfast table while Potts the salesman talked to no one in particular about the price of dry goods. Beaumont was expanding his operation in the spring. He needed a man to run the braking operation, 20 or 30 horses to start, more as the season developed. Good pay, real responsibility, the kind of position that was a step above ranch hand in every way that mattered if a man was thinking about his future in those terms. He'd thought of Gideon first, Beaumont wrote, because Gideon was the best he'd worked with, and because word traveled in the ranch circuit and he'd heard Gideon was still moving around without a permanent situation. "A man with your skills shouldn't be hiring out day by day," Beaumont had written, with the directness that Gideon had always respected in him. "Come up in March. The job's yours if you want it." Gideon read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket and ate his eggs. Potts was still talking. Outside the window, the snow was coming down in the thin, determined way of a storm that intended to outlast the day. He thought about the letter at Halford's, splitting wood in the cold with the methodical rhythm that left his hands occupied and his mind free. He thought about it clearly and without flinching, which was the only way he knew how to think about hard things. Wyoming was a real opportunity. Beaumont was a fair man, and the money would be the most he'd made in years, and the work was exactly suited to his skills. A year ago, 6 months ago, even, the answer would have been obvious and immediate. He would have written back that day.
He thought about Eleanor. He thought about what he knew of her, which was more than most people knew and less than he wanted to. He thought about the workshop with its fierce order and its warmth, and the kitchen that had been cold until he had arranged the firewood, and the bench they shared on evenings when the orders ran long. He thought about Jacob, who couldn't whistle, and Thomas, who had spent 20 minutes explaining fire. He thought about the candle. He thought about what it would mean to leave, and whether Eleanor would say anything if he did, and whether she'd light the candle just the same and not let on that anything had changed, because she had gotten very good over 4 years at not letting on that things affected her. That was the thought that settled it, not the sentiment of it, the specific practical recognition that Eleanor Mercer had already survived the worst kind of leaving, and that she would survive his too, and that this was not a reason to stay. The reason to stay was simpler and more difficult than any of that. The reason to stay was that he had stopped wanting to leave. He wrote back to Beaumont that evening in his room at Vera's. He thanked him for the offer and declined it. He said he'd found a situation in Black Hollow that suited him and that he intended to stay on. He kept it to 3 sentences because Beaumont was a man who didn't need more than 3 sentences, and because the longer version of the explanation was not something Gideon was prepared to write down. He posted the letter the next morning and felt, walking back from the post office in the cold, the particular clarity that followed a real decision. Not relief exactly, because there was still uncertainty ahead, still the hard work of whatever came next. But the clarity, the absence of the weight of choosing. He was staying. That was done. What remained was considerably more complicated. He told Eleanor about the letter on a Thursday evening in the workshop, while they were halfway through a set of harness repairs that were due the following Monday. He didn't plan to tell her, but he'd intended, actually, not to tell her, on the theory that it was a private matter that had been resolved and didn't need to be explained. But she'd looked up at him at some point during the second hour of work and said, without particular preamble, "Something's on your mind." It wasn't a question. She'd learned him well enough by now to read the difference between his comfortable silences and his occupied ones. "Got a letter last week," he said, "from an old foreman in Wyoming. Offered me a good position." Eleanor set down the piece she was working on and gave him her full attention, which was not something she gave easily or diluted when she gave it. Her face was careful. "What kind of position?" "Running a braking operation. More pay, more responsibility." He kept his hands moving on the leather in front of him, not looking up. The kind of thing a man doesn't turn down, usually. A silence that lasted precisely as long as it needed to. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him no." He looked up then. "I wrote back 4 days ago." Eleanor looked at him steadily. He could see her working through it. What the offer meant, what the refusal meant, what the gap between the two contained. "Because of Black Hollow?" she asked. And the careful way she phrased it, "not because of me," told him she wasn't going to make assumptions, was not going to claim a cause that hadn't been stated, because she was Eleanor and she did not take things that hadn't been offered. "Because of Black Hollow," he said, which was true, and was also not the whole truth, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them pushed past that point because the ground between them was real, but still new, and new ground required care. "All right," she said. She picked up her work. "Hand me the awl." He handed her the awl. They finished the harness set by 9 o'clock, which was later than they usually worked, and when Eleanor made coffee, she'd started doing this somewhere in November, making coffee at the end of the work evenings, another door opening by 1 more inch. They sat at the kitchen table in the warmth of the stove and the quiet of the late hour, and Gideon thought, not for the first time, that this was the steadiest he'd felt in years. "I want to ask you something," he said. She wrapped her hands around her cup and waited. "Not tonight," he said. "I'm not asking tonight, but I want you to know that I have something to ask you. So it doesn't come out of nowhere when it does." Eleanor was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not respond at all. When she spoke, her voice was carefully level, the way a person is careful when they're carrying something they don't want to spill. "How long have you been thinking about this?" she asked. "Honestly?" "Always." "Since November," he said. "The night you told me about Jacob and the whistling." She looked at her coffee cup. A small muscle in her jaw moved once. That's a while to carry something without saying it. I wanted to be sure, he said, and I wanted you to have time. Time, she repeated, with a particular inflection that he couldn't fully read, something between wry and something more vulnerable than that. I've had 4 years of time, Gideon. I know. I meant time with me, to know if it was something you could want. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had eased off somewhat, the way it did late in the evening, saving itself for morning. I'm not the same as I was, she said. It came out low and direct, the tone she used when she was saying something she'd been holding for a long time. Before Thomas, before all of it. I was easier then. I was lighter. She looked up at him. What's here now is what's here. I come with all of it. The candle, the grief, the years of being shut away in this house. I don't know how to separate any of that out. I know that, he said. I'm not sure you do. Eleanor. He waited until she was looking at him. I don't want you without the candle. I don't want you without Thomas and Jacob. I'm not asking for a version of you that doesn't include them. He paused, trying to find the words that were right and not just close. They're part of why you are the way you are. And the way you are is what He stopped, tried again. It's what I drove past on Milliken Street every evening for 6 weeks before I could admit I was doing it on purpose. Something happened in Eleanor's face that was not quite like any other expression he'd seen from her. Not the almost smile, not the careful politeness, not the raw, quickly covered openness he'd glimpsed in rare moments. This was something older and quieter and far more exposed, the face of a woman who had made herself very small for a very long time and had just been told by someone she was beginning to trust that there was room to be larger again. She didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but only just. Ask me, she said, when you're ready. I'm not saying yes and I'm not saying no. I'm saying ask me. He nodded. They finished their coffee. He put on his coat and she walked him to the door, the same as always. But when he stepped out onto the porch, she said his name. Not Mr. Hart, not Gideon in the formal way, just Gideon, plain and direct. And he turned. She was standing in the doorway with the workshop light behind her and the cold, dark porch in front of her. And she looked for just a moment like a woman who was standing in a threshold she hadn't stood in for years, testing the boards to see if they'd hold her weight. Thank you, she said, for staying. He could have said you're welcome. He could have said something careful and proportionate. Instead, he said, there wasn't anywhere else I wanted to be, which was the truest thing he could offer and which, from the way she looked at him, was also exactly what she needed to hear. She went back inside. The door closed. On the porch railing, the candle burned the last of its evening, steady and unchanged, the same as it had been every night for 4 years. But it looked different to him tonight. Or maybe he was looking at it differently, now that he knew the whole of what it meant. He stood there for a moment in the cold, his breath making clouds in the dark air, and he thought about Thomas reading stories to a boy who couldn't whistle, and about how those evenings had been so ordinary when they were happening and had become, in their ending, the thing most worth preserving. He walked home. Behind him, eventually, the candle went out. In the morning, Eleanor would light it again. January was the quietest month. Not peaceful, quiet in the way that a held breath is quiet, the way a room is quiet after someone has said something that changed it permanently. The snow had settled deep around Black Hollow, and the town had pulled itself inward the way towns did in real winter, and the days were short and gray, and the nights were long and very cold. And Gideon worked at Halford's in the mornings and came to Milliken Street in the evenings, and the pattern held, steady as the candle, as reliable as anything he'd known. But something was different now. Both of them felt it, and neither of them named it, and the unnamed thing sat in the workshop between them like a third person, quiet and patient, waiting. He hadn't asked yet. He'd said he would ask when he was ready, and he was ready, had been ready since before he'd said it, but he kept finding the same obstruction, not fear exactly, not uncertainty about what he wanted, but a specific, stubborn care about doing it right. Eleanor was not a woman you approached carelessly. She was not a woman you stumbled toward with half-formed words and hoped for the best. She deserved something considered,
something that showed he understood the full weight of what he was asking, which was not simply for her hand but for her trust, which was a considerably more serious thing, and one she had given to almost nobody in 4 years. He thought about how to say it. He revised it. He discarded the revisions. He thought about it again in the cold pre-dawn while Halford's horses shifted in their stalls and his breath made clouds in the barn air, and he thought about it in the evenings after he'd left her and was walking back through the snow to Vera's. And it was beginning to feel like the thinking was the obstacle, which meant the thinking needed to stop. The week before he finally said it, Eleanor got a letter of her own. She mentioned it without drama on a Tuesday evening, setting it on the corner of the workbench with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been deciding whether to bring it up at all. "My sister wrote," she said. She hadn't mentioned a sister before. "From Ohio. She heard—" Someone wrote to her. I don't know who. "She heard there's a man spending time here." Gideon looked up from the bridle he was conditioning. "What did she say?" he asked. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "She said she was glad, and she said—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "She said she hoped I wasn't going to ruin it by being afraid." "Are you?" he asked. "Afraid. Yes," she said, without hesitation, and the directness of it surprised him. Eleanor rarely admitted to the things that made her vulnerable. Not quickly, not without the long approach she took with most revelations. Not the way I was afraid after Thomas. That fear it was like being in the water and not being able to find up. This is different. She looked at the letter. This is afraid the way you're afraid of something you actually want, because wanting something means it can be taken. He set down the bridle. "I know that kind of afraid," he said. "I know you do." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. "I'm telling you because I think you should know where I am, before you—" She paused. "Before whatever you're working yourself up to." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is it that obvious?" "Gideon, you've been thinking so hard for 3 weeks I can hear it from across the table." He laughed, a real one, short and genuine, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she'd made him laugh, which was not quite satisfaction but was close to it, the look of a woman rediscovering that she could do this, that this was still something she was capable of. "All right," he said. He pushed back from the table and turned to face her fully. "Then I'll stop thinking about it." She went still. He didn't get down on a knee. He didn't reach for her hand because he understood that Eleanor needed to be able to look at him straight on for this, needed to have all of herself available and not be caught off balance by gesture. He just sat there across the workbench from her, in the room she'd built into the shape of her survival, with the tools on their pegs and the oil lamps burning and the cold outside pressing against the windows. And he said it. "I want to marry you, Eleanor. Not because I think you need someone, because you don't. You've made that clear, and it's one of the things about you that I—" He stopped, kept himself on track. "I want to marry you because I want to be here. In this house, in this town, at this table. I want to work beside you and argue with you about the right way to punch a hole in leather and bring in firewood when you pretend you don't need it." He held her eyes. "I want to light the candle with you in the evenings, not instead of Thomas and Jacob, with them. Because they're part of this house and they're part of you, and I'm not asking you to put them down to take my hand. I'm asking you to let me stand in this place with all of you, every part, the grief and the workshop and the 2 hours every night and all of it." Eleanor hadn't moved. He'd noticed, over the months of knowing her, that she went very still when she was feeling something large. The stillness was not absence, but its opposite. The full concentration of a person who needed to hold themselves together while something moved through them. She was very still now. "Thomas read to Jacob in the evenings," she said finally, and her voice was low and slightly unsteady in a way he'd heard only once before, the night she told him about the whistling. Every night without fail, rain or cold, it didn't matter. For 2 years, from the time Jacob was old enough to sit still for a story, Thomas read to him on that porch. She looked at her hands. "When they were gone, I kept the candle because I didn't know how to let that hour just be an empty hour. It was always their hour. I couldn't let it become nothing." "I know," he said quietly. "I kept it for them." She looked up, and her eyes were bright in the lamplight with something she wasn't going to let fall. Not yet. Maybe not tonight.
But I also kept it because I needed to believe that the things we do for the people we love don't disappear when they do. That the love itself is still. That it stays somewhere. That it meant something permanent, even if they're not here to see it. It meant something, he said. It means something. I've watched that candle from the street for 6 months, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that it means something. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was entirely human, the kind of sound that only comes from a place too complicated for either. "I'm not easy," she said. It was not an apology. It was information, delivered honestly, the way she delivered everything. "I'm set in my ways, and I don't always say what I'm feeling when I should, and I will absolutely tell you when you're doing something wrong in my workshop." "I know all of that. I'm serious, Gideon." "So am I," he said. "I'm not asking for easy. I've had easy. Easy just means you haven't found anything worth working for yet." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He'd learned by now that being looked at by Eleanor Mercer, really looked at, with that full, undeflected attention she brought to things she needed to understand, was not a comfortable experience, but it was an honest one. She saw what was there. She didn't construct a more convenient version. It was one of the things about her that he trusted most. "Yes," she said. Just the one word. No preamble, no softening, no careful qualification. Just yes, clear and direct. The way Eleanor said everything that mattered. He exhaled. He hadn't known he'd been holding it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back, and the word between them felt like a door finally swung open on both sides, like a latch released, like the end of a very long-held breath. They sat there in the workshop for a moment, just the two of them in the lamplight with the workbench between them and the cold outside and the future somewhere beyond the window. Not simple, not guaranteed, but there. Real and there. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, just for a moment, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who had decided to stop being careful about what she allowed herself to want. Then she pulled her hand back and picked up her work. "We still have 3 hours left on these," she said, nodding at the pile of harness repairs. He picked up the bridle he'd set down. "Tell me how you want the stitching on the near cheek piece. Close, tight as you can manage." "Show me first." She showed him. They worked until late, the same as always, except that everything was different, and neither of them needed to say so. They told no one that evening. They told no one the next day either, not because they were hiding it, but because it was theirs first, and they were not in a hurry to make it public. Eleanor told Margaret Hale on Thursday, matter-of-factly, in the general store, with the directness she brought to everything, and Margaret had gripped her hand across the counter and pressed her lips together hard and said, "Good. That's good, Eleanor," in the voice of a woman who had watched someone she cared about be alone for too long. Gideon told Hector because Hector was the kind of man who found out everything anyway, and it was better to tell him directly. Hector had nodded slowly, with the expression of a man confirming a conclusion he had arrived at some time ago. 6 weeks, he said. "I gave it 6 weeks from the first time you asked about her firewood. You didn't say anything?" "None of my business," Hector said. "Until it is. When's the wedding?" "Spring," Gideon said. We're still deciding." "Good weather for it," Hector said, and went back to his work. Vera cried, which surprised no one who knew her and surprised her considerably. She produced the tears at breakfast the morning after Gideon told her, briefly and without apparent warning, and then composed herself with great efficiency and asked about the plans and whether they'd need anything. And when Gideon said he didn't know yet, she said, "Well, find out," and put more coffee in his cup. The town adjusted. It did what small towns do, which is absorb new information into the existing fabric without ceremony, and within 2 weeks the fact of Eleanor Mercer and Gideon Hart was simply part of what Black Hollow knew about itself, filed alongside everything else, neither as remarkable nor as unremarkable as it first appeared. Dale Cutter was seen at the general store 3 days after the news had circulated, and said nothing to anyone about it, which was its own kind of answer. The wedding was in March, on a Saturday when the snow had begun to thin, and the first tentative warmth was making promises the weather hadn't fully committed to yet. It was not a large affair. Eleanor had been specific about that. She wanted the people who had actually shown up in her life, not a production, not a performance of joy for an audience that had spent 4 years watching her grieve. Margaret Hale and her husband, Vera and 2 of the long-term boarders, Hector Dunn, who wore his good coat and looked deeply uncomfortable in it and would not take it off regardless. Old Man Halford, who came without being asked and stood in the back and said exactly one thing to Gideon afterward, which was, "Don't be stupid about it," which was, from Halford, a benediction. The Reverend kept it brief, which was at Eleanor's specific request, and when it was done and they were standing outside in the thin March sunlight, Gideon thought that he had been to weddings that were larger and more formally beautiful and had felt emptier than this specific collection of people who actually knew the 2 of them, standing in the cold on a Saturday, squinting into the light. Eleanor stood beside him in a dark green dress she'd made herself, her hair properly pinned for once, though a strand had already escaped near her right ear, and she shook hands and accepted hugs with the slight careful formality of someone who had not been touched warmly by many people in a long time and was not entirely sure of the protocol. He watched her settle into it gradually, the way she settled into most things. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a growing solidity, like ground finding its own level. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had not put it down. You couldn't put down the things that mattered. You knew that now. Both of them knew that, but had found someone to stand beside her while she carried it, and the weight was the same, but the distribution of it was different, and different was enough. Different was considerable. That evening, back at the house on Milliken Street, their house now, which was a word Gideon was still learning the full weight of. Eleanor cooked supper, and he set the table, and they ate in the kitchen with the stove going and the outside cold held at bay. And it was not unlike every other supper they'd shared, except that it was entirely unlike it. The same way a familiar road looks different when you know you're not leaving it. After the dishes, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. "Come out to the porch," she said. He followed her through the house and out into the cold March night. The sky was clear, the stars sharp the way they got in winter air, and the mountains to the north were dark shapes against a slightly lighter dark. Eleanor took the box of matches from her apron pocket. She always kept them there, had for 4 years, the same pocket, the same box, and she held them out to him. He looked at her face. She was watching him steadily, with the same expression she'd had in the doorway the night she'd told him about Thomas reading to Jacob. The expression of someone standing in a threshold, testing the floor. "You light it tonight," she said. He took the matches. His hand was steady. He struck the match and held it to the candle, and the flame caught and held, small and immediate against the darkness. He set it on the railing where it had always been set and stood back beside her, and they looked at it together, the 2 of them in the cold, and the flame didn't waver. He understood what she was doing. He understood it completely, the way you understand things that are said without words. She wasn't passing him the candle because she needed help lighting it. She'd been lighting it alone for 4 years. She was passing it to him because the candle was the most interior thing she owned, the most private ritual, the truest part of her, and handing it to another person's hands was the fullest version of what she'd said yes to 3 weeks ago in the workshop. More than the ceremony this morning, more than the ring he'd put on her finger. This. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just stand here." He stood there. They stayed on the porch for the full 2 hours, the same as always. The same length of time Thomas used to read. The same flame. The cold was real, and neither of them had brought out enough coat for it, and Eleanor's shoulder eventually pressed against his arm, simply because it was warmer that way, and he didn't move away, and she didn't either. She told him more about Jacob that night. Not the large things. She'd told him those, the ones that cost something to say. These were the small ones, the ones that lived in the corners of memory, that Jacob had had a particular laugh that started silently before it became sound, the whole of his face changing before a noise came out, that he'd been terrified of grasshoppers but refused to admit it, would walk 6 feet around one in the road and then deny he'd done it, that he'd called Thomas Dad, except when he was very tired, and then it became Papa, always, without fail, and Thomas never commented on it, but Eleanor had seen every time what it did to his face. She talked and the candle burned and Gideon listened with his full attention, the way he had learned to listen to Eleanor. Not waiting for a pause to say something, but actually present, actually there,
taking in everything she offered as the specific and irreplaceable thing it was. He would have liked you, she said, toward the end of the 2 hours. She said it to the mountains, not to him directly, but he heard the whole weight of it. He liked quiet people. He said they were better listeners. Smart kid, Gideon said. He was, she said, simple and complete. He was. When the 2 hours were done, she didn't pick up the candle immediately. She let it burn another few minutes, which was new. She had always been exact about the time, always brought it in at precisely the 2-hour mark. But tonight she let it run a little longer, and he understood that too. The ritual was the same, but it had room in it now for something additional, for the slight loosening that came when a thing didn't have to be held so tightly because there were 2 people holding it instead of 1. Finally, she picked it up and cupped her hand around the flame and blew it out, and the porch went dark except for the stars and the faint light from the kitchen window. "We should go in," she said. "It's cold." "It is," he agreed, and neither of them moved for another moment. Standing in the dark on the porch of a house that was theirs now, on a street in a frontier town at the edge of nowhere, carrying between them the weight of everything they had lost and everything they were choosing, which turned out to be not 2 separate things, but the same thing, the same continuous thing, love and grief and love again in a line that didn't break. She went in first. He followed. He closed the door behind him. Inside, the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning, and the evening was, in most observable ways, entirely ordinary. Supper dishes drying on the rack, the canvas apron on its hook, the small stack of next week's work orders on the corner of the kitchen table, the iron stove doing what it had always done. But on the work table in the front room, Gideon Hart's tools sat beside Eleanor's on the same bench, his punches and his needles arranged with the beginning of an order he was still learning, not as neat as hers, not yet, probably not ever. And the lamps they'd burned together for months had left their particular smell in the wood of the table, and the chair across from hers had the slight worn place on the back rung that came from the same person sitting in the same place night after night. He had been leaving his mark on this place without knowing he was doing it. They both had. That was the thing about staying. You didn't always notice you were doing it, the actual accumulating substance of it, the daily weight of a presence, the slow proof of a decision made not once but every day, quietly, without ceremony. You looked up one morning and the mark was there, and you understood that this was what choosing looked like from the inside. Not grand, not clean, just the honest, imperfect daily fact of a person who decided to remain. Gideon had spent 7 years leaving. He'd been good at it. He told himself it was practical, told himself it was freedom, and it had been both of those things, and also, underneath both of those things, a way of not risking the thing that had broken him when his brother died. The specific pain of losing something you'd allowed yourself to need. He understood now that you could protect yourself from that pain completely and successfully, and it would cost you everything worth having. The protection was real, but the price was everything. He'd been paying it for 7 years, one impermanent departure at a time, arriving nowhere and leaving everywhere and calling it a life because it was easier than the alternative. Eleanor had done the opposite. She had stayed in her grief the same way she stayed in her town, in her house, in her workshop, with absolute fidelity, refusing to be moved from what mattered, keeping the candle lit in the face of everything that would have extinguished it. Her stubbornness, which the town had sometimes called sadness, and sometimes called strength, and sometimes called something it didn't have a name for, had been the most honest thing about her. She had not pretended to be finished loving the people she'd lost. She had not put on the performance of recovery that would have made everyone around her more comfortable. She had just kept the light. And somehow that light, kept for Thomas, kept for Jacob, kept out of love so stubborn it didn't know how to become anything else, had been visible from the road. Visible to a quiet man on a gray horse who had no plan to stop anywhere and had not understood, until he was already past the point of easy retreat, that the light had already found him. Healing didn't come from forgetting. He knew that now with the certainty of experience, his and hers both. It didn't come from moving on, from replacing what was lost, from the well-meaning insistence of a world that found grief inconvenient and wanted it to have an expiration date. It came from the willingness to carry what you'd loved forward into the next day, and the day after, and the one after that, until the carrying became natural, until it was just the shape of you, the shape of a person who had loved something real and refused to let that fact disappear. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and Eleanor was at the stove with her back to him,
putting the kettle on for the last tea of the evening the same way she always did. And there was oil on her left forearm, the same as there had been the first time he'd seen her at the door of this house. And her hair had come down entirely from its pins now, which happened by this hour most nights. And she was not thinking about him particularly, just doing what she did, inhabiting her life with the full, unself-conscious presence she brought to everything. He thought about Beaumont's letter, and Wyoming, and all the roads that led away from here. He was glad he hadn't taken any of them. "Tea?" Eleanor said, without turning around. "Please," he said, and sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the candle was dark. The porch was cold and empty, the way it was always empty after the 2 hours were done. Not abandoned, not finished, just resting until tomorrow evening, when Eleanor would come out at the turn of dark with her matches in her apron pocket and strike a flame against the coming night and keep it burning for 2 hours that belonged to the people she had loved and gone on loving past every reason to stop. Except tomorrow evening, she would not be alone. She would never be alone on that porch again. And the candle, which had burned for 4 years as a single point of light at the edge of a frontier town where most people had stopped expecting anything to change, the candle would burn the same way it always had, small and steady and refusing to go out. It just wouldn't be the loneliest thing in the world anymore. That was enough. That was more than enough.